Welcome to this journey through one of the most disturbing cases recorded in the history of Kentucky. Before we begin, I invite you to leave in the comments where you're watching from and the exact time at which you're listening to this narration. We're interested in knowing to what places and at what times of day or night these documented accounts reach. The air hung heavy over Madison County, Kentucky, in the autumn of 1864, a time when the Civil War had torn families apart, leaving scattered remains of once whole communities. It was during this period of national fracture that local authorities documented a series of disappearances along the eastern routes, particularly near the wooded areas surrounding Boone County. What initially appeared as war casualties or deserters fleeing conscription would later be understood as something far more disturbing. County records from October 1864 noted the discovery of an abandoned cabin approximately 17 miles northeast of Richmond. What made this discovery unusual wasn't the cabin itself, but rather what Sheriff Thomas Holloway described in his report as the peculiar arrangement of personal effects, as if the occupant had intended to return. Most telling was a leather-bound journal discovered beneath the floorboards, containing entries dating from 1859 to 1864. The handwriting, methodical and unnervingly precise, belonged to a man who identified himself only as Helm. The journal was eventually transferred to the Kentucky Historical Society in 1961, where researchers began the painstaking process of piecing together what would become known as the Boone Helm case. According to parish records examined by Dr. Jonathan Ellis of Transylvania University in 1965, the Helm family had migrated to Kentucky from Tennessee in the early 1850s. They were initially documented in the census records as residing in the vicinity of Lexington, before relocating to a more remote property near the eastern edge of Boone County in 1857. The family consisted of Thomas Helm, his wife Sarah, and their son Boone, who was approximately 19 years of age when they settled in Kentucky. Thomas Helm was listed in county records as a carpenter by trade, though neighbors interviewed decades later recalled that he rarely sought work in the surrounding communities. The family maintained a small farmstead, growing just enough to sustain themselves with occasional surplus to trade for necessities at the general store in Florence, some 7 miles from their property. Mrs. Sarah Helm, according to church attendance records, participated sporadically in ladies' auxiliary meetings, though parish notes indicate she maintained a reserved demeanor and spoke little of family matters. These sparse details, gleaned from fragmentary records of the period, present the outline of a family that existed on the periphery of their community, present but not integrated, seen but not known. Boone County in the 1860s represented the quintessential rural American experience. Small farmsteads dotted the landscape, connected by dirt roads that turned to mud during the frequent rains. The Helm family had settled in the area around 1857, according to parish records from the First Baptist Church of Florence. They were unremarkable in most aspects, a father, mother, and son who kept largely to themselves. Neighbors from the period interviewed decades later by local historian Robert Chambers for his never-published manuscript Forgotten Crimes of the Border States, 1968, described the family as private but not unfriendly. Mrs. Eleanor Sutton, who lived approximately 2 miles from the Helm property, recalled, "They came to Sunday service regular-like, but all was left before the social gathering afterward. The father would nod politely, but rarely engaged in conversation. The son, Boone was his name, had an intensity about him. Even as a young man, he would stare at you like he was memorizing your face." According to church records examined by Professor William Marlett for his study Religious Life in Pre-War Kentucky, 1969, the Helm family attended services at First Baptist Church approximately twice monthly from their arrival in 1857 until early 1859. Reverend Josiah Whitaker, who presided over the congregation during this period, maintained detailed notes on his parishioners, including tithes contributed and attendance patterns. His personal diary, preserved in the church archives and reviewed during the 1969 study, contains a curious notation regarding the Helm family, dated January 23, 1859. Spoke with Thomas H. after service regarding the boy's behavior during prayer. T assured me the matter would be addressed at home. Sarah appeared distressed throughout the conversation, though she spoke not a word. The nature of the behavior that prompted this discussion is not specified, though Reverend Whitaker's subsequent entry from February 6 notes, "The H family absent again. This marks 3 services without their presence." T had spoken of the boy's difficulties. "I fear the family struggles with a burden they cannot share with the congregation. Church records indicate the family never returned to services after this date. What precipitated the family's withdrawal from community life remains uncertain. However, county records indicate that in March 1859, a local farmer reported several animals missing, 2 pigs and a calf. While theft was not uncommon during those times, what drew attention was the manner in which the animals were taken. According to the farmer's statement, transcribed in faded ink in the county sheriff's logbook, no blood was found where the animals should have been. They were taken with precision, as if by someone who knew the proper way to butcher. My dogs made no sound during the night, which suggests they knew the visitor. No formal investigation followed, as resources were limited, and such crimes were considered minor compared to the growing tensions preceding the Civil War. However, this report marks the first in a pattern of similar incidents that would spread across 3 counties over the following months. The Helm family name appears nowhere in these reports. However, a curious detail emerges in Boone Helm's journal discovered years later. An entry dated March 18, 1859, contains only the words, "Necessary provisions acquired. Father disapproves of methods." This cryptic notation, analyzed by forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Gardner in his 1967 paper, Linguistic Patterns in Criminal Documentation, suggests what he termed a significant disconnect between action and moral recognition. In simpler terms, an acknowledgement of wrongdoing without accompanying remorse. A subsequent entry dated March 20th elaborates slightly. "Father demanded I replace what was taken. Impossible. The work has already begun. The shed behind the north field serves adequately for the present needs." County maps from the period examined by researchers in 1966 confirmed the existence of a small outbuilding approximately a quarter-mile from the main Helm residence, situated in a wooded area that would have provided considerable privacy from the infrequent traffic on the nearby road. Throughout the spring of 1859, local records indicate an increase in community tensions unrelated to the impending national conflict. The Florence Weekly Gazette, in its April 29th edition, published a brief notice requesting residents to secure livestock and report unusual persons on their property following incidents of animal theft and property damage. No specific incidents are detailed, though county sheriff records document 3 additional reports of missing livestock between April and June, all within a 10-mile radius of the Helm property. More telling are the personal diaries of Samuel Kenton, a farmer whose property adjoined the Helm land. His entries, discovered by his great-granddaughter and donated to the Kentucky Historical Society in 1964, describe increasingly disturbing observations. April 12, 1859. Heard strange noises from the direction of the H property last night, not like normal farm sounds, a kind of rhythmic thumping that continued for nearly an hour, too steady for chopping wood. And later, May 30, 1859, found peculiar marks along the creek that divides our properties, what appeared to be drag marks leading from the water's edge toward their north field. Considered inquiring with T, but something held me back. The boy was watching from their porch as I examined the area, did not wave or call out as would be customary. The summer of 1859 brought drought to Kentucky, driving many farmers to desperation as crops failed and water sources dwindled. It was during this period that the first human disappearance occurred. A traveling salesman named William Porter, who had been making his rounds through the region. According to accounts published in the Kentucky Gazette, July 1859, Porter was last seen leaving a general store in Florence, heading east along what is now the Boone County line. His wagon was discovered 3 days later, the horse still tethered nearby, grazing peacefully. The merchandise remained largely untouched, except for a set of butcher knives that the store owner confirmed had been part of Porter's inventory. No blood was found at the scene. No body was ever recovered. The local authorities, limited in resources and experience with such cases, concluded that Porter had likely been robbed and his body hidden or disposed of in one of the many limestone caves that dotted the region. The case was documented, but remained uninvestigated. In Helm's journal, an entry dated 3 days after Porter's disappearance reads simply, "The traveling man had quality tools, necessary for the work ahead." A subsequent entry, dated 1 week later, contains a more disturbing notation. Father discovered the new tools. Confrontation ensued. He threatens to contact authorities if he finds any more evidence of my sickness, as he calls it. Mother weeps constantly now. Their disappointment is a noise I cannot abide. Dr. Gardner's analysis of these entries suggests a significant escalation in both Helm's activities and the family's awareness of them, a dangerous convergence that criminologists recognize as a potential trigger for violence within family systems. What is perhaps most disturbing about the subsequent months is how normal life appeared to continue in the communities surrounding the Helm property. Harvests were gathered, though meager. Sunday services continued. Children attended the small schoolhouse near Florence. Yet a pattern was emerging that only becomes clear in retrospect through the careful examination of scattered records. Between August 1859 and April 1860, 4 more individuals were reported missing across Boone, Kenton, and Campbell counties. Each disappearance followed a similar pattern: travelers, often alone, with no witnesses to their vanishing, and minimal evidence left behind. In each case, local authorities documented the reports but conducted only cursory investigations. These documents, collected and analyzed by Dr. Margaret Holden of the University of Kentucky in her 1967 study of pre-Civil War crime patterns, reveal a troubling administrative indifference that allowed for what may have been a methodical predator to operate undetected. The Helm Journal, covering this same period, contains increasingly detailed entries about the construction of what he refers to as the cellar room and preservation techniques. One entry from November 1859 notes, "Father discovered the lower space today. His disappointment wounds deeper than his anger. Mother hasn't stopped crying. They don't understand the necessity." A subsequent entry dated December 3, 1859, provides a rare glimpse into the psychological state of Sarah Helm. "Mother brought food to the shed today. First time she has acknowledged my work directly. She left it at the door and departed quickly, unable to look at me, but she came. Progress of a kind." This interaction, analyzed by forensic psychiatrist Dr. Elizabeth Montgomery in her 1968 paper, Family Dynamics in Violent Crime Scenarios, suggests what she terms coerced complicity, a phenomenon where family members, unable to directly confront or stop disturbing behavior, begin to accommodate it in various ways. Montgomery notes that this accommodation should not be mistaken for approval or assistance, but rather represents a psychological survival mechanism in the face of overwhelming fear or cognitive dissonance. County records indicate that Thomas Helm made a single visit to the sheriff's office in Florence on January 17, 1860. The purpose of this visit is not documented, as no formal complaint was filed. However, Deputy Sheriff James Calloway noted in his personal logbook, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1963, T. Helm called today agitated state, began to speak of concerns regarding son, but stopped abruptly, requested information about sanitarium options in Louisville, provided what details I possessed, left without filing report. Unusual behavior noted. This brief record represents the only documented attempt by Thomas Helm to seek outside intervention regarding his son's behavior. The journal entries for this period show a marked change in tone, with increasing references to what Helm calls the necessity of silence and the failure of words to contain the noise. An entry dated January 18, 1860 reads, "Father's betrayal confirmed. Observed his return from town. His intentions are clear. Preparations must be accelerated. The lower space requires reinforcement." Between January and May 1860, local newspapers reported 2 additional disappearances: a mail carrier whose route passed within 3 miles of the Helm property, and a livestock trader known to travel the region purchasing cattle from distressed farms. In neither case was a connection made to previous disappearances, with authorities attributing them to the increasing lawlessness that accompanied the mounting tensions between North and South. The Helm Journal entries during this period become increasingly erratic, with some pages containing only repeated phrases such as "the noise continues" or "silence is necessary," written in varying sizes and pressures of pen strokes. Dr. Gardner's analysis suggests these pages demonstrate periods of extreme psychological distress or dissociative episodes, consistent with what modern psychology might classify as psychotic breaks. In May 1860, the Helm property experienced what neighbors described as a terrible accident. According to the limited records available, a fire destroyed the main house during the night. The county coroner's report indicates that 2 bodies presumed to be the elder Helms were recovered from the ruins. The report notes that both bodies were found in their bed, suggesting they had been asleep when the fire started. What the report mentions only briefly, almost as an afterthought, is that the county physician observed that the elder Mr. Helm had an unusual wound to the neck area, possibly sustained during the collapse of the burning structure. No further investigation was conducted. The son, Boone Helm, was not present during the fire. According to statements given by neighbors compiled in the sheriff's report, the young man had mentioned plans to visit relatives in Missouri some days prior. A telegram was reportedly sent to notify him of his parents' passing, but no response was ever recorded. The property, largely reduced to ash, except for a stone foundation, and what was described as a root cellar, was eventually sold at auction to cover outstanding debts. The journal entries from this period are missing, with the next dated entry appearing in July 1860, simply stating, "Missouri provides new opportunities. The hunger remains." Samuel Kenton's diary contains a final reference to the Helm family dated May 12, 1860. The remains of the H place still smolder. Sheriff's men found the bodies as expected in their bed. What they did not investigate was the shed near the north field. I considered speaking up, but found I could not form the words. Some things are perhaps better left undisturbed. I will not walk that portion of my property again. What follows in the historical record is a curious silence regarding Boone Helm's whereabouts for approximately 8 months. This gap, analyzed by historians specializing in Western migration patterns, coincides with typical travel times for individuals moving from Kentucky to the Western Territories during this period. Dr. Thomas Reynolds, in his 1966 study, Migration Patterns During the Civil War Era, notes that individuals traveling west from the border states typically followed river routes when possible, making use of steamboat transportation along the Mississippi before transitioning to overland travel from established river ports. Passenger manifests from steamboats operating during this period were notoriously incomplete, making it difficult to track specific individuals. However, Dr. Reynolds's research identified several vessels that transported passengers from Kentucky to Missouri ports between May and July 1860. Any of which could potentially have carried Boone Helm westward. His name resurfaces in a report from the sheriff's office in St. Joseph, Missouri, dated February 1861. The document, discovered during a courthouse renovation in 1963, describes the questioning of a man matching Helm's description in connection with the disappearance of two miners who had been celebrating a significant gold find. The report, written by Deputy Sheriff William Garner, notes, "Subject identified self as Boone Helm, recently arrived from Kentucky. Claims to be seeking employment with westward expeditions. When questioned regarding his whereabouts on the night of February 12th, provided names of 3 individuals who later confirmed his presence at Taylor's saloon throughout the evening in question. No evidence connecting subject to the missing miners was discovered." The report concludes with a notation that Helm was released and advised to remain available for further questioning if needed. In Helm's journal, an entry from February 1861 reads, "Close encounter with authority. They lack imagination. Moving west seems prudent now. The mountains offer solitude for my work. This marks the beginning of what appears to be a westward journey, tracked through scattered reports, witness accounts, and the increasingly erratic journal entries that would later help researchers piece together the extent of Helm's activities." A subsequent entry, dated March 3, 1861, provides insight into his methodology. "Secured position with wagon train heading to Montana Territory. The trailmaster values my hunting skills. Little does he understand that game is not my preferred quarry. Patience required. The isolation of the trail will provide opportunities that town life cannot." The wagon train referenced in Helm's journal has been identified by historians as the Barnett Cummings expedition, which departed St. Joseph in early March 1861, with approximately 40 individuals seeking opportunities in the goldfields of Montana Territory. According to the trailmaster's log, preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives and examined by researchers in 1964, a man identified as B. Helm joined the party as a hunter and scout, having demonstrated considerable skill with both rifle and knife. The log makes several references to Helm throughout the journey, noting his tendency to range far from the main party while hunting and his occasional absences of a day or more. An entry dated April 17, 1861, notes, "Helm returned after 2-day absence, claims to have been tracking elk herd that proved elusive, brought no game, but appears satisfied nonetheless. Unusual man, keeps to himself after dark." Several travelers express unease in his presence, though he has performed his duties adequately. By the summer of 1861, as the Civil War intensified across the nation, reports of missing persons along the western trails increased dramatically. Most were attributed to the chaos of war, Native American conflicts, or the natural dangers of frontier travel. However, a disturbing pattern emerged in certain cases. Lone travelers found without their provisions, sometimes with precise cuts to their clothing, and often missing specific personal items. These details, documented in various territorial reports and collected by U.S. Marshal James Simmons in his 1866 report on frontier crimes during the war years, contain descriptions that bear striking similarities to the methodology described in Helm's journal. An entry from September 1861, written while Helm was apparently in the Idaho Territory, provides a chilling insight. "The mountains provide. Today's traveler carried letters from a family in Ohio. Read them all before proceeding with the necessary work. The connection to their words made the process more meaningful. They had a name for what I do in the medical books he carried. It does not matter what they call it. What matters is the quiet afterward." This entry, analyzed by criminologist Dr. Robert Gardner, represents what he terms a significant evolutionary step in the subject's psychological framework, a transition from viewing his actions as simply necessary work to finding a perverse form of connection through the personal effects of his victims. Dr. Gardner notes in his analysis that this type of escalation is consistent with patterns observed in modern serial offenders, where the psychological rewards of the crimes often evolve and intensify over time. What makes the Helm case particularly unusual for its historical period is the existence of the journal itself, a contemporaneous record of not just actions, but the accompanying psychological state, provided by the perpetrator himself. The winter of 1861 into 1862 was particularly harsh in the mountain territories. Travel became nearly impossible through the high passes, forcing even the most determined travelers to seek shelter in the scattered mining communities and outposts. It was during this period of forced proximity to others that witnesses later reported encounters with a man believed to be Boone Helm. In the mining settlement of Virginia City, Montana Territory, several residents recalled a man who kept to himself, but occasionally engaged in card games at the local saloon. Thomas Burdett, a barkeeper interviewed by a Helena newspaper in 1868, described him as a quiet sort, mostly, though he'd get a certain look when drinking. Like he was sizing folks up, not as people, but as something else entirely. Made my skin crawl, though I couldn't have said why at the time. Another Virginia City resident, Sarah Connolly, who operated a boarding house, where Helm reportedly stayed for approximately 6 weeks during the winter of 1861-1862, provided a more detailed account in correspondence with historian Robert Chambers in 1967. He paid promptly and caused no disturbances, which was unusual enough among the mining crowd. Always polite in a formal way, though never warm. What I recall most distinctly was his habit of writing in a small book each evening by lamplight. Hours he would spend at it, his face showing no expression whatsoever. The other peculiar thing was his trunk. He kept it locked at all times and was most particular that no one should disturb it during cleaning. Once, when I delivered fresh linens, I noticed an unusual odor from the trunk. When I inquired if something might be spoiling, he informed me quite calmly that he collected specimens from his hunting expeditions that he intended to sell to Eastern collectors. I did not inquire further, though the smell was not like any game I had encountered. The journal entries from this period reveal Helm's frustration with his inability to continue what he called his work, due to the close quarters of winter living. A February 1862 entry reads, "The hunger grows impossible to ignore. The walls of this place close in, too many eyes, too many questions. Spring cannot come soon enough." A subsequent entry dated March 2, 1862, suggests a near breaking point. The landlady grows suspicious of the trunk. Considered silencing her, but the location is problematic. Too many witnesses. Too much attention would follow. The snow on the high passes begins to melt. Soon the trails will open, and with them, new opportunities for necessary silence. When spring finally arrived in 1862, allowing mountain passes to clear, a new series of disappearances began. Between April and October 1862, territorial authorities documented at least 7 missing persons cases across Montana, Idaho, and northern Utah. None were connected at the time, attributed instead to the dangers of frontier life. In each case, the missing individuals had been traveling alone or had separated from larger groups. What makes these cases particularly disturbing is that in 3 instances, partial remains were discovered, not through official searches, but by hunters or trappers who stumbled upon them months later. The condition of these remains, as documented in coroner's reports collected by Dr. Holden, indicated precise, almost surgical cutting patterns that one examiner noted were consistent with someone possessing knowledge of human anatomy. Helm's journal from this period contains detailed descriptions of locations along remote trails, waiting periods, and what he refers to as the procedure, though he avoids explicit details of violence. Instead, he focuses on what he describes as the moment of quieting and the peace that follows the necessary work. One entry from June 1862 is particularly revealing of his psychology. They all ask why, as if there could be a reason that would satisfy them. The truth is simple. The world is loud with human noise. I create silence, one voice at a time. A subsequent entry, dated July 14, 1862, demonstrates an increasing ritualization of his process. Established new location near Bannock Trail. The outcropping provides excellent vantage of the approach for nearly half a mile. selected for its proximity to the creek, necessary for the cleansing stage. Today's subject fought more than most. Curious how the noisy ones always believe they can outshout the inevitable. The silence, when it finally came, seemed more profound by contrast, kept the timepiece as a reminder. By late 1862, territorial authorities had begun to suspect that the disappearances might be connected. A U.S. Marshal named Robert McGuire, stationed in Montana Territory, compiled the first known attempt to link the cases. His report, dated November 1862 and discovered in federal archives in 1964, notes the similarities in victim profiles and disappearance circumstances. He writes, "It is the opinion of this office that these cases may be the work of a single individual or a small group operating along the main travel routes. The precision with which the victims are selected, typically men traveling alone with valuable provisions but few connections in the territory, suggests premeditation rather than opportunity." McGuire's report recommended increased patrols along known travel routes and the circulation of warning notices to travelers. However, with resources stretched thin by the ongoing Civil War, his recommendations were largely ignored by his superiors. Helm's journal entries indicate an awareness of increased scrutiny. A December 1862 entry reads, "Word spreads of a hunter in these parts. They misunderstand. This is not hunting. This is correction. The noise of humanity requires balancing. Nevertheless, adaptation is necessary." A subsequent entry details changes in his methodology. Relocated operations to less frequented trail 20 miles south. Less traffic, but greater security. He established new procedure. Observation period extended to 3 days to ensure subject travels alone. Disposal now requires additional stages to prevent discovery. The work becomes more complex, but the silence remains the reward. What follows in both the historical record and Helm's journal is a period of movement. Throughout 1863, reports of similar disappearances emerge across a wider geographical area, reaching as far south as Colorado Territory and as far west as the Washington Territory. The pattern remained consistent, but the locations varied significantly, suggesting a traveler who never remained in one place for long. Territorial newspapers began publishing warnings about traveling alone, though they attributed the dangers to road agents or Indian troubles, rather than speculating about a single perpetrator. In March 1863, the Rocky Mountain News published an editorial noting the curious increase in lone travelers vanishing without trace, and advising readers to travel in numbers and remain vigilant against strangers who express too much interest in one's journey or possessions. Helm's journal from this period reveals a growing sense of purpose and refinement of method. An entry from April 1863 states, "The work becomes more efficient with practice, the selection more intuitive. There is a moment when their eyes reveal they understand what is happening. That moment has become essential to the process." Dr. Gardner's analysis of these entries suggests what he terms a profound decompensation of moral framework, noting that the increasing focus on the victim's moments of realization indicates a significant shift from the earlier justifications of creating silence to a more direct gratification derived from the victim's fear and understanding of their fate. By late 1863, Helm appears to have established a pattern of attaching himself to groups of travelers before identifying potential victims who would subsequently separate from the main party. A journal entry from October 1863 provides insight into this strategy. "Joined mining expedition as guide, 8 men seeking fortune, all strangers to each other. The isolation of shared purpose creates false bonds. They trust too easily. The German speaks often of returning east with his findings. His nostalgia makes him careless. He wanders to be alone with his thoughts of home. The irony does not escape me. His silence will be particularly meaningful." In early 1864, a significant development occurred that would eventually lead to the end of Boone Helm's activities. In Virginia City, Montana Territory, a miners' court convicted 5 men of various crimes, including road agent activities and murder. Among them was a man identified as Boone Helm. According to court transcripts preserved in the Montana Historical Society archives and examined by researchers in 1965, Helm was not initially suspected of being the perpetrator of the disappearances that had plagued the territories. Rather, he was arrested as part of a gang led by Henry Plummer, who had been terrorizing gold shipments and wealthy miners. During the hasty trial typical of frontier justice, witnesses testified to Helm's association with known criminals and his presence during at least 2 robberies. What was not introduced at trial but was recorded in the personal journal of the miners' court judge, James Williams, was a disturbing statement allegedly made by Helm during his imprisonment awaiting trial. Williams wrote, "The prisoner Helm made a most unsettling remark when informed of his impending execution. He stated that what they're hanging me for ain't nothing compared to what I've done when I'm alone with them on the trail." When pressed for clarification, he merely smiled and said no more on the subject. This statement, discovered decades later, provides the first public connection between Helm and the pattern of disappearances. Another account, recorded in the personal diary of jailer Edward Burton and discovered during a family estate sale in Bozeman in 1968, provides additional details of Helm's behavior during his final days. The condemned man Helm shows none of the typical distress one might expect. He spends hours writing in a small book, which he guards jealously. When not writing, he often sits completely motionless, staring at the wall or ceiling. The only time I observed any change in his demeanor was when Reverend Slade came to offer spiritual counsel. Helm became agitated, stating that the Reverend's words are just more noise in an already too loud world. He refused all subsequent visits from the clergy and requested only paper and ink for his final days. On January 14, 1864, Boone Helm was hanged alongside 4 other men in Virginia City. According to newspaper accounts from the Virginia City Montanian, Helm remained defiant to the end, showing no remorse and even joking with the crowd that had gathered to witness the execution. The article quotes him as saying, "Every man for his own. I've lived by my own rules, and I'll die the same way." What the newspaper account doesn't mention, but was recorded in the personal papers of Deputy Marshal William Palmer, discovered during a family estate sale in Bozeman in 1966, was that after Helm's execution, authorities searched his lodgings and discovered a small leather-bound journal and a collection of personal items that did not appear to belong to him, including pocket watches, wedding bands, and folded letters addressed to people who were not Helm. Palmer's notes indicate that he recognized some of the items as potentially belonging to individuals who had been reported missing over the previous years. He forwarded the journal and items to the territorial governor's office, but with the chaos of the ongoing Civil War and the remote nature of the territory, no comprehensive investigation followed. Palmer's final notation regarding the matter, dated February 3, 1864, states, "No response received regarding Helm materials. Items placed in storage at Territorial Office, pending further instruction." Personal opinion is that these effects may provide evidence of crimes beyond those for which Helm was executed. War demands attention elsewhere, however. Perhaps future authorities will make better use of what we have discovered. The years following Helm's execution saw a significant decrease in unexplained disappearances along the western trails. This correlation, noted by U.S. Marshal James Simmons in his 1866 report, was not recognized as significant at the time. The end of the Civil War brought increased federal presence to the territories, improved communication between law enforcement agencies, and a general decrease in the isolation that had characterized frontier travel during the war years. Helm's case might have remained simply one of many frontier criminals executed for their crimes, were it not for the discovery of his journal during a cataloging project at the Montana Historical Society in 1961. Dr. Eleanor Westbrook, the archivist who first recognized the significance of the document, wrote in her initial assessment, "The journal appears to be the personal record of an individual responsible for numerous disappearances and likely murders across several territories during the period of 1859–1864. The writer, identified as Boone Helm, documents his activities with a disturbing detachment and ritual precision that suggests a methodology far more systematic than the typical frontier criminal of the period." Dr. Westbrook's discovery prompted a more comprehensive examination of the journal by forensic psychologist Dr. Robert Gardner, whose 1963 analysis concluded, "The document represents a rare historical example of what modern criminology would classify as the psychological evolution of a serial murderer." The writer demonstrates several characteristics consistent with psychopathic personality structures, including a profound lack of empathy, ritualistic behavior patterns, trophy collection, and the development of a complex personal mythology to justify his actions. Of particular interest is the recurring theme of silencing noise, a metaphorical framework that appears to have provided the subject with a sense of purpose and justification. Following Dr. Gardner's preliminary analysis, historians and criminologists began the painstaking process of correlating Helm's journal entries with documented disappearances across the territories he traversed. This work, led by Dr. St. Margaret Holden of the University of Kentucky, involved extensive archival research across 7 states and territories, examining sheriff's reports, newspaper accounts, and personal correspondence from the period. Dr. Holden's team identified 23 cases between 1859 and 1864 that matched both the geographical locations mentioned in Helm's journal and his described methodology. In 17 of these cases, the timing of journal entries corresponded precisely with documented disappearances. The Boone Helm case represents one of the earliest documented instances of what modern criminology would classify as a serial killer operating in the American frontier. The journal, which now resides in a secure location within the Montana Historical Society archives, provides a rare, contemporaneous account from the perpetrator's perspective. What makes the case particularly disturbing is not just the number of potential victims, estimated by Dr. Holden's 1967 study to be between 15 and 28 individuals, but the methodical nature of the crimes and the stark contrast between Helm's public persona and his private activities. The journal reveals a man who viewed his actions not as crimes, but as a form of necessary work, a correction to what he perceived as the excessive noise of humanity. His ability to move undetected across vast territories during a period of national crisis demonstrates how the geographical and social conditions of the frontier created perfect conditions for such predators to operate with minimal risk of detection. In 1968, a team of researchers from the University of Kentucky, led by Dr. Margaret Holden, attempted to trace the potential victims mentioned in Helm's journal by cross-referencing disappearance reports from the territories with the dates and locations noted in his entries. Their work, documented in the unpublished manuscript The Silence Maker, a comprehensive study of the Boone Helm case, identified 17 individuals whose disappearances closely matched the pattern described in the journal. Dr. Holden's conclusion, noted in her personal correspondence with the FBI's newly formed Behavioral Science Unit, suggested that Helm represents an important historical case study in the development of forensic psychology, particularly regarding the evolution of methodical violent offenders in early American society. The manuscript was never published, reportedly due to concerns about sensationalizing the crimes and the inability to definitively link Helm to all the disappearances. Noted. The research materials were subsequently sealed in the university archives, with access restricted to academic researchers with specific clearance. One particularly disturbing aspect of the Helm case that emerged from Dr. Holden's research was the evidence suggesting that his activities began before the documented disappearances in 1859. Additionally, interviews conducted with distant relatives of the Helm family in 1968 revealed troubling childhood behaviors that had become family legends, stories of animal mutilations, prolonged solitary activities in remote areas, and what one elderly cousin described as a stillness about him that wasn't natural in a child. These retrospective accounts, while impossible to verify conclusively, align with patterns that modern criminology associates with the developmental trajectory of violent offenders. Her team's examination of records from Tennessee, where the Helm family resided before relocating to Kentucky, identified 3 cases of missing persons between 1856 and 1857 that bore similarities to the later pattern. The story of Boone Helm remains one of the darkest chapters in the history of the American frontier, a reminder that even in the mythologized Wild West, where violence was often attributed to obvious causes like robbery, revenge, or drunken disputes, there existed more insidious threats. The isolated nature of frontier travel, the limited communication between law enforcement agencies, and the general acceptance of disappearances as an inevitable part of Western expansion created an environment where someone like Helm could operate for years without detection. Perhaps most disturbing is the final entry in Helm's journal, dated January 13, 1864, the day before his execution. It reads, "They believe they're ending something tomorrow. They don't understand that the silence I've created remains. Each quiet space where a voice once was continues to exist. My work lives beyond me." In the fading light of a Kentucky afternoon in 1864, as Boone Helm faced the noose in a distant Montana mining town, the true extent of his activities remained unknown to those who executed him. The echoes of that silence would remain undiscovered for nearly a century, preserved in the careful handwriting of a journal that traveled from a burning Kentucky farmhouse to a Montana archive, waiting for someone to finally hear the story it contained. The investigation into Helm's crimes continues to this day, albeit in academic rather than legal contexts. In 1969, forensic anthropologist Dr. James Ridley conducted a survey of unmarked burial sites along known frontier trails, using geographical references from Helm's journal as potential locations. While conclusive identification proved impossible, given the time elapsed and the condition of any remains, Dr. Ridley's team documented 7 sites that corresponded with locations mentioned in the journal and contained human remains showing evidence of the precise cutting patterns described in earlier coroner's reports. In his published findings, Forensic Archaeology and Historical Crimes, 1969, Dr. Ridley noted, "While scientific certainty regarding the attribution of these remains to Helm's activities is impossible given the limitations of available evidence, the correlation between journal descriptions, historical disappearances, and archaeological findings strongly suggests a connection that cannot be dismissed as coincidental." Today, more than a century and a half later, the sites connected to Boone Helm have largely been reclaimed by time. The foundation of the Helm family home in Kentucky was eventually built over as the county expanded. The remote trails where he allegedly waited for victims have become highways or returned to wilderness. Virginia City, where his life ended, stands as a preserved historical site, though tour guides rarely mention his name among the colorful characters of the town's past. Yet for those who have studied the case, who have read the journal entries or traced the disappearances across faded territorial maps, the legacy of Boone Helm serves as a reminder that sometimes the most terrifying monsters are not those of legend or superstition, but ordinary men who move quietly through the world, leaving silence in their wake. Dr. Margaret Holden, in her final assessment of the case before her research materials were sealed in 1968, wrote, "The Helm case represents a historical anomaly, not because such individuals did not exist in earlier periods, but because the documentation of their activities and psychology rarely survived. One must wonder how many similar predators moved through the dark spaces of history, their actions attributed to war, disease, accident, or the general dangers of their eras. The silence they created extended beyond their victims to include the very recognition of their existence. In this observation lies perhaps the most disturbing aspect of the Boone Helm story. Not just what we know, but what similar stories have been lost to time, their victims forgotten, their perpetrators never identified, their silences complete. As one researcher noted in the margins of Dr. Holden's manuscript, the truly disturbing aspect of the Helm case is not what we know, but what we don't. How many unnamed travelers rest in unmarked graves along the western trails, their stories untold, their silence complete. And so the story of Boone Helm stands as a dark chapter in American history, a reminder that beneath the familiar narratives of frontier adventure and opportunity lay deeper currents of danger, isolation, and the terrible vulnerability of individuals far from home, whose disappearances might leave barely a ripple in the historical record. Their silence, created by one man's disturbed perception of necessity, speaks to us still across the centuries, a warning that the wilderness was not the only thing to fear on the American frontier.